Picture this. It's 1547, and one of the most powerful kings in European history is dying. Henry VIII of England has ruled for nearly 4 decades, but as he takes his final breaths, he's surrounded not by loving family, but by the ghosts of his past decisions. 6 wives, 2 executions, 3 annulments, 1 death in childbirth. You might be wondering, how does one man go through 6 marriages in a single lifetime? And more importantly, why? Here's what most people don't understand about Henry VIII. His personal life wasn't just about love, lust, or even cruelty. It was about survival. The survival of a dynasty, a religion, and a nation. Every marriage was a political chess move. Every divorce was a declaration of war. Every execution was a desperate attempt to secure something that seemed impossible: a male heir to continue the Tudor line. Today, we're going to dive deep into the complex personal world of Henry VIII. But I'm not here to tell you salacious stories or spread gossip that's been twisted by centuries of rumor. Instead, I want you to understand the real Henry, the man caught between medieval tradition and Renaissance revolution, between personal desire and political necessity. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Henry's marriages weren't just personal relationships. They were the driving force behind one of the most dramatic periods in English history. You'll see how a king's desperate search for a son led to the creation of a new church, the execution of some of the most powerful people in England, and ultimately changed the course of Western civilization. We're going to explore each of Henry's 6 wives, not as victims or villains, but as real people caught up in the dangerous world of Tudor politics. You'll discover how Catherine of Aragon's refusal to disappear quietly sparked the English Reformation, how Anne Boleyn's intelligence and ambition both elevated and doomed her, how Jane Seymour's death in childbirth haunted Henry for the rest of his life. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. Every single one of Henry's marital decisions was influenced by the political realities of 16th century Europe. This wasn't just about a king who couldn't keep a wife. This was about international diplomacy, religious revolution, and the delicate balance of power that kept England from being crushed by its more powerful neighbors. So settle in, because we're about to explore one of history's most complex royal relationships, the tangled web of politics, religion, and personal ambition that surrounded Henry VIII's quest for the perfect marriage. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll never think about Henry VIII the same way again. Are you ready to meet the real Henry VIII? Let's begin. Before we dive into Henry's 6 marriages, you need to understand something crucial. Marriage in the 16th century wasn't about love. I know that might sound harsh to modern ears, but here's the reality. For royalty, marriage was the most important diplomatic tool they had. Think about it this way. Imagine you're running a country in 1509. You don't have nuclear weapons, you don't have a massive standing army, and your treasury is always on the edge of empty. How do you protect your nation? How do you secure alliances? How do you guarantee that your family will continue to rule after you're gone? The answer was marriage. Royal marriages were like signing international treaties, except instead of ink and paper, you used wedding rings and wedding beds. When Henry VIII became king in 1509, England was not the powerful nation it would later become. France was bigger, richer, and more populated. Spain controlled vast territories in the New World and had seemingly unlimited wealth flowing in from the Americas. The Holy Roman Empire stretched across much of Central Europe. England was an island nation on the edge of Europe, desperately trying to punch above its weight. Henry inherited a throne that was still relatively new. His father, Henry VII, had only established the Tudor dynasty in 1485 after defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. That's just 24 years before Henry VIII took power. In royal terms, the Tudors were still the new kids on the block, and everyone was watching to see if they could hold on to power. Here's where things get complicated, and this is absolutely crucial to understanding everything that follows. Henry was obsessed with having a male heir, and he had very good reasons to be. In 1509, the idea of a woman ruling England successfully was almost unthinkable. Yes, there had been queens in English history, but their reigns were often marked by civil war, invasion, or political chaos. The recent memory of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal series of civil wars that had torn England apart in the previous century, made everyone terrified of a succession crisis. Henry looked at history and saw what happened when the succession wasn't clear. Brothers fighting brothers, nobles choosing sides, foreign powers invading to support their preferred candidate. He was determined that would never happen to England again. But there was another layer to this story that modern audiences often miss: the religious significance of marriage and fertility in the 16th century. People genuinely believed that God directly influenced whether couples could have children. A childless marriage wasn't just unfortunate, it was seen as a sign of God's displeasure. This belief was so strong that it influenced everything from politics to daily life. When a royal marriage failed to produce children, people didn't just wonder about medical reasons. They wondered what sin had been committed that would cause God to withhold his blessing. Now let's talk about what life was actually like at Henry's court, because this is where the real drama happened. The Tudor court wasn't just a place where the king lived, it was the center of English political, social, and cultural life. Hundreds of nobles, servants, ambassadors, and hangers-on lived and worked in close quarters, creating an atmosphere that was part political headquarters, part social club, and part reality TV show. Think about the pressure cooker environment this created. Everyone was watching everyone else. Every conversation could be political. Every flirtation could be treason. Every friendship could be a conspiracy. And at the center of it all was Henry, a king who was charming, intelligent, athletic, and absolutely convinced of his own divine right to rule. The young Henry VIII was nothing like the bloated, paranoid tyrant he would become in later life. When he took the throne at age 17, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in Europe. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall, athletic, handsome, and incredibly charismatic. He spoke multiple languages, wrote poetry and music, and was an accomplished athlete who could hunt, joust, and dance with equal skill. This wasn't a man who expected to be refused anything. Henry had grown up as a prince, surrounded by people who told him he was destined for greatness. When he wanted something, whether it was a military victory, a political alliance, or a woman, he expected to get it. But here's what made Henry truly dangerous. He genuinely believed that his desires and God's will were the same thing. When Henry wanted something, he convinced himself that God wanted him to have it too. This wasn't just royal arrogance. This was a fundamental part of how Henry understood his role as king. In the Tudor court, marriage wasn't a private affair. Every aspect of a royal marriage was public, from the wedding ceremony to the wedding night. Court observers would literally wait outside the royal bedroom to hear evidence that the marriage had been consummated. The Queen's monthly cycles were monitored by court physicians. Every potential pregnancy was international news. This constant scrutiny put enormous pressure on royal wives. They weren't just expected to be loving companions. They were expected to be political assets who could produce male heirs on demand. Failure wasn't just personal disappointment, it was a political crisis that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Every time Henry considered a new marriage, it sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Foreign ambassadors would frantically send reports to their home countries. Marriage negotiations could take years and involve detailed discussions of dowries, military alliances, and trade agreements. When Henry married Catherine of Aragon, he was cementing an alliance with Spain against France. When he pursued Anne Boleyn, he was risking war with the Holy Roman Empire. When he married Anne of Cleves, he was trying to build Protestant alliances in Northern Europe. Each marriage was a statement about England's position in the complex web of European politics. Here's something that might surprise you. Some of England's most powerful noble families actively pushed their daughters toward the king, even knowing the risks. The Boleyn family, the Seymour family, the Howard family, they all saw royal marriage as their ticket to ultimate political power. These families understood that having a daughter marry the king could elevate their entire bloodline for generations. Yes, there were risks. Royal wives who failed to produce sons or who fell out of favor could face imprisonment, exile, or even execution. But the potential rewards were so enormous that ambitious families were willing to take those risks. Now that you understand the world Henry VIII lived in, the political pressures, the religious beliefs, the court culture, and the international stakes, you're ready to understand his 6 marriages not as romantic relationships, but as a series of increasingly desperate political and personal gambles. Each wife represented a different strategy, a different hope, a different attempt to solve the fundamental problem of Henry's reign: how to secure the Tudor dynasty and maintain England's position in a dangerous world. Some of these strategies worked, at least temporarily. Others failed catastrophically. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. Through it all, we can see Henry changing from an optimistic young king who believed everything would work out to a paranoid tyrant who saw enemies everywhere and was willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. So let's meet the 6 women who shaped not just Henry's personal life, but the entire course of English history, starting with the woman who would set the pattern for everything that followed, Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who refused to disappear quietly. Imagine being married to the same person for 24 years, only to have them suddenly announce that your marriage was never valid, that your daughter is illegitimate, and that you need to disappear from public life forever. That's exactly what happened to Catherine of Aragon, and her refusal to accept this fate would literally tear England away from the Catholic Church and reshape European history. Catherine wasn't just any Spanish princess, she was royalty of the highest order. Born in 1485, she was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same monarchs who had funded Christopher Columbus's voyages and completed the Reconquista by driving the last Muslims out of Spain. When Catherine was born, Spain was emerging as the dominant European power, and her parents were among the most successful rulers of their generation. From birth, Catherine was educated to be a queen. She learned Latin, philosophy, theology, and canon law, subjects that most women of the era never studied. Her parents specifically prepared her for a life of political leadership because they knew that royal marriages were about creating powerful alliances, not romantic fulfillment. Here's where Catherine's story gets complicated from the very beginning. She was originally married to Arthur, Henry's older brother and the heir to the English throne. This marriage, arranged when Catherine was just 3 years old, was designed to cement an alliance between Spain and England against their mutual enemy, France. Catherine arrived in England in 1501 when she was 15 years old. The wedding ceremony was magnificent, exactly the kind of international spectacle that was supposed to show the world that England and Spain were united. But then, just 5 months after the wedding, Arthur died suddenly, probably from illness. And this is where everything that would later destroy Catherine's life began. Did Catherine and Arthur consummate their marriage during those 5 months? It sounds like a simple question, but in the world of 16th century politics and religion, this question would eventually tear apart the English Church. You might be wondering why this mattered so much. Here's the thing. According to Catholic Church law at the time, If Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage, then Catherine was permanently Arthur's widow. Church law said she could never validly marry Arthur's brother Henry, because that would be marrying her brother-in-law, which was considered a form of incest. But if Catherine and Arthur had never consummated their marriage, then in the eyes of the church, they were never truly married. Catherine would still be a virgin, and she could legitimately marry Henry without any religious complications. Catherine always insisted that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, that she remained a virgin and was therefore free to marry Henry. She maintained this position for the rest of her life, even when it would have been politically convenient to change her story. When Henry became king in 1509, one of his first acts was to marry Catherine. This wasn't just romantic, though by all accounts, the young Henry and Catherine did seem genuinely fond of each other. It was also politically brilliant. By marrying Catherine, Henry was maintaining the Spanish alliance that his father had worked so hard to create. The early years of Henry and Catherine's marriage seem to have been genuinely happy. Contemporary accounts describe them dancing together, hunting together, and enjoying each other's company. Henry was 17, Catherine was 23, and they appeared to be a successful royal couple. Catherine quickly became pregnant, which must have seemed like divine confirmation that their marriage was blessed by God. Unfortunately, this is where Catherine's personal tragedy began. Her first child, a daughter, was born prematurely and died shortly after birth. This was devastating, but not necessarily alarming. Infant mortality was tragically common in the 16th century, even among royalty. What happened next would haunt Catherine and Henry for the rest of their marriage. Between 1510 and 1518, Catherine became pregnant at least 6 times. Most of these pregnancies ended in miscarriage or the birth of children who died in infancy. Only one child survived, Mary, born in 1516. You have to understand how psychologically devastating this would have been for both Catherine and Henry. In their worldview, fertility was a sign of God's blessing, and infertility was a sign of God's displeasure. With each pregnancy loss, the question became more pressing. What had they done to anger God? For Catherine personally, this was both a private grief and a public failure. Her primary job as queen was to produce a male heir, and she was failing spectacularly. Every miscarriage was not just a personal loss, but a political crisis. Every month that passed without a pregnancy announcement was another month of international speculation about the stability of the English succession. By the 1520s, Henry was becoming increasingly desperate. He was approaching 30. Catherine was in her 40s, and they still had no male heir. Henry began to worry that Catherine might never give him a son, and the possibility of leaving England without a male heir terrified him. But there was another factor that complicated everything. Henry had fallen in love with someone else. Anne Boleyn had arrived at court, and Henry was completely infatuated with her. Suddenly, Henry wasn't just worried about not having a son. He actively wanted to marry a different woman. This created a problem that seemed impossible to solve. Henry was married to Catherine in the eyes of both the church and English law. Divorce, as we understand it today, didn't exist. The only way to end a marriage was to prove that it had never been valid in the first place, what the church called an annulment. This is when Henry's lawyers and theologians came up with what seemed like a brilliant solution. Remember that old question about whether Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage? Henry's team argued that they had, which meant Catherine's marriage to Henry was invalid because she was already married to Arthur in the eyes of God. Henry convinced himself that this explained everything. The reason Catherine couldn't give him a surviving son wasn't medical. It was divine punishment for living in an invalid marriage. The Bible itself seemed to support this interpretation. Leviticus 20:21 says, If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother. They will be childless. Childless. To Henry, this seemed like proof that God disapproved of his marriage to Catherine. The solution was obvious. Annul the marriage, marry Anne Boleyn, and start producing legitimate male heirs immediately. But Catherine refused to cooperate with this plan, and her refusal was both principled and politically strategic. Catherine genuinely believed that her marriage to Henry was valid in the eyes of God. She had sworn before God that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, and she wasn't about to change her story now just because it was politically convenient. More importantly, Catherine understood the implications of Henry's annulment better than almost anyone else. If their marriage was declared invalid, their daughter Mary would be declared illegitimate and would lose her place in the line of succession. Catherine wasn't just fighting for her own position, she was fighting for her daughter's future. Catherine also had powerful allies. Her nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who controlled much of Europe and had significant influence over the Pope. Charles had no intention of allowing his aunt to be humiliated by the English king, especially if it meant damaging Spanish prestige. This is where Catherine's personal struggle became an international crisis. The Pope was caught between two of Europe's most powerful rulers. Henry was threatening to break England away from the Catholic Church if he didn't get his annulment. Charles was threatening military action if the Pope granted the annulment. For several years, the Pope tried to find a compromise that would satisfy everyone. He suggested that Catherine might voluntarily enter a convent, which would free Henry to remarry without requiring a formal annulment. Catherine rejected this suggestion outright. The Pope also tried to delay making a decision, hoping that the political situation would change or that Henry would lose interest in Anne Boleyn. This strategy backfired spectacularly. The longer the Pope delayed, the more desperate and angry Henry became. In 1529, Henry and Catherine appeared before a special papal court in England to argue their case. This was Catherine's moment to make her final public stand, and she used it brilliantly. Instead of presenting legal arguments through lawyers, Catherine knelt before Henry and spoke directly to him in front of the entire court. She reminded Henry of their 20 years of marriage, proclaimed her loyalty and love, and insisted that she had come to him as a virgin. Then, in a dramatic gesture that shocked everyone present, she stood up, curtsied to Henry as her king and husband, and walked out of the court. She refused to participate in any further proceedings, arguing that as Henry's true wife, she couldn't be part of a process designed to prove she wasn't his wife. When Henry finally broke with Rome and declared his marriage to Catherine invalid, Catherine's life became a kind of royal exile. She was stripped of her title as queen and was thereafter known only as the Dowager Princess of Wales, Arthur's widow. Catherine spent her final years in relative isolation, moving between various royal residences, but never again appearing at court. She maintained her dignity and her faith, continuing to sign her letters, Catherine the Queen, until her death in 1536. Henry never saw Catherine again after their separation, and there's evidence that he regretted how their relationship ended. When Catherine died, some suspected she had been poisoned, though this was never proven. Henry ordered court mourning, suggesting that despite everything that had happened, he retained some genuine affection for his first wife. Catherine of Aragon's refusal to accept Henry's annulment changed the course of world history. Her resistance forced Henry to break with Rome, establish the Church of England, and begin the English Reformation. Without Catherine's principled stand, England might never have become a Protestant nation. But Catherine's legacy is also personal. She showed that royal women didn't have to be passive victims of political circumstances. She used her education, her international connections, and her moral authority to fight for what she believed was right, even when it cost her everything. Catherine's daughter Mary would eventually become Queen of England and would spend her reign trying to return England to Catholicism, a direct result of the trauma her mother experienced. The religious conflicts that would define English politics for the next century can be traced directly back to Catherine's refusal to disappear quietly when Henry decided he wanted a different wife. Now, let's meet the woman who caused all this upheaval. Anne Boleyn, the English courtier who captured Henry's heart and lost her head in the process. Anne Boleyn is probably the most famous of Henry VIII's wives, and for good reason. She's the woman who brought down a queen, split England from Rome, and gave birth to one of England's greatest monarchs, Elizabeth I. But here's what most people don't understand about Anne. She wasn't just Henry's infatuation. She was one of the most politically savvy women of her era, and her rise and fall reveals everything about the dangerous game of Tudor court politics. Anne Boleyn wasn't born to be queen. She came from the Boleyn family, who were successful merchants and minor nobility, but nowhere near the royal bloodline. What the Boleyns lacked in ancient titles, they made up for in ambition and intelligence. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat who understood that the fastest way to rise in Tudor society was to get close to the royal family. Anne's education was extraordinary for a woman of her time. She was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, and later to the French court, where she spent several formative years. This gave Anne something that most English court ladies lacked: international sophistication and exposure to Renaissance humanism and reformist religious ideas. When Anne returned to the English court around 1522, she was probably in her early 20s, though her exact birth date is unknown. She was not considered the most beautiful woman at court, but she had something far more dangerous: intelligence, wit, and an understanding of how to use both to her advantage. Here's where Anne showed her political genius. When Henry began pursuing her around 1526, Anne could have followed the typical pattern of becoming the king's mistress, enjoying a few years of royal favor, and then being discarded when Henry lost interest. Her sister Mary had already done exactly that, but Anne had bigger plans. She understood that if she became just another royal mistress, she would eventually be replaced and forgotten. Instead, Anne played a much more dangerous game. She refused to sleep with Henry unless he married her. Think about how bold this strategy was. Anne was essentially telling the King of England that he couldn't have her unless he was willing to overturn centuries of tradition, break with the Catholic Church, and risk international warfare. The audacity was breathtaking, and it worked because Henry had never encountered a woman who wouldn't give him what he wanted. Henry's pursuit of Anne lasted for approximately 6 years, from 1526 to 1532. During this time, Anne walked a tightrope between encouraging Henry's interest and maintaining her position that she wouldn't become his mistress. This required incredible political skill, because one wrong move could have resulted in her banishment from court or worse. Anne's letters to Henry during this period and his responses give us a window into their relationship. Henry's letters are almost pathetic in their desperation. He writes about his anguish at being separated from her and begs for some sign of her affection. Anne's responses are much more calculated. She maintains her position while keeping Henry interested, a balancing act that required extraordinary emotional intelligence. But Anne wasn't just playing hard to get for personal reasons. She understood that her refusal to become Henry's mistress was forcing him to consider more radical solutions to his marital problems. Every month that Anne held out was another month that Henry became more committed to the idea of annulling his marriage to Catherine. Here's something that often gets overlooked in romantic retellings of Anne's story. She was genuinely committed to religious reform. Anne wasn't just a pretty face who happened to catch the king's eye. She was an educated woman who had been exposed to reformist ideas during her time in France and who actively promoted Protestant theology in England. Anne owned books by reformist theologians, some of which were technically illegal in England at the time. She used her influence with Henry to promote reformist bishops and to protect Protestants who were being persecuted for their beliefs. When Henry was wavering about breaking with Rome, Anne was one of the voices encouraging him to move forward with the split. This wasn't just political calculation, though Anne certainly understood that a break with Rome would remove the main obstacle to her marriage with Henry. Anne seems to have genuinely believed that the English Church needed reform and that papal authority was corrupt and illegitimate. By late 1532, Anne was finally pregnant and Henry could wait no longer. They were secretly married in November 1532 or January 1533. The exact date is unclear because the ceremony had to be kept secret until Henry's annulment from Catherine was finalized. This secret marriage was incredibly risky for both Anne and Henry. If word leaked before the annulment was complete, Anne could be accused of bigamy and adultery, both capital crimes. Henry was essentially betting his entire kingdom on the assumption that he could make his actions retroactively legitimate. The pregnancy also put enormous pressure on Anne. Everyone assumed she was carrying the male heir that Henry desperately needed. If Anne gave birth to a son, it would prove that God approved of their marriage. If she gave birth to a daughter, or if the pregnancy ended in miscarriage, it would raise uncomfortable questions about whether their marriage was any more blessed than Henry's marriage to Catherine had been. When Anne gave birth to Elizabeth in September 1533, the disappointment was crushing. Henry had been so confident that Anne was carrying a son that he had already prepared announcements declaring the birth of a prince. The letters had to be hastily altered to change prince to princess. You have to understand how devastating this was for both Anne and Henry. Henry had risked everything: his relationship with the Pope, his alliance with Catherine's powerful nephew Charles V, the stability of his kingdom, based on the assumption that Anne would give him the male heir that Catherine couldn't provide. Elizabeth's birth proved that Anne was fertile, but it also raised the terrifying possibility that she might have the same problems producing male heirs that Catherine had experienced. For Anne personally, Elizabeth's birth was both a triumph and a disaster. She had successfully given birth to a healthy child, proving her fertility. But she had failed in her primary mission as queen, producing a male heir. From the moment Elizabeth was born, Anne was under enormous pressure to become pregnant again as quickly as possible. The next 3 years of Anne's life were marked by this relentless pressure to produce a male heir. She became pregnant again in 1534, but miscarried. She became pregnant again in 1535 and miscarried again. Each pregnancy loss was not just a personal tragedy, but a political crisis that weakened Anne's position and strengthened the hand of her enemies. Henry's behavior during this period shows how his attitude toward Anne was changing. The passionate lover who had waited 6 years to marry her was becoming impatient and critical. Henry began making comments suggesting that their marriage might have been a mistake. He started paying attention to other women at court, most notably Jane Seymour. Anne, who had once been confident and in control, became increasingly desperate. She made political enemies by pushing too hard for religious reform. She alienated potential allies by appearing arrogant and demanding. Most dangerously, she began to panic about Henry's growing interest in Jane Seymour. In January 1536, 2 events occurred that sealed Anne's fate. First, Catherine of Aragon died, which removed one of the main obstacles to Henry abandoning Anne. As long as Catherine was alive, Henry couldn't return to his first marriage, even if he wanted to. But with Catherine dead, Henry's options became much more flexible. Second, Anne suffered another miscarriage, and this one was particularly devastating because the fetus was reportedly male and well developed. Henry saw this as proof that God disapproved of his marriage to Anne just as much as he had disapproved of his marriage to Catherine. Within months of Catherine's death and Anne's final miscarriage, Henry's attitude toward Anne had completely changed. The woman he had once been willing to risk everything to marry had become, in his mind, another obstacle to getting the male heir he desperately needed. The specific charges against Anne, adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, were almost certainly fabricated. The evidence was thin, the confessions were extracted under torture, and the timeline of the alleged affairs was impossible, given Anne's closely monitored schedule as queen. But the charges didn't need to be true. They just needed to be believable enough to provide Henry with legal justification for what he wanted to do anyway. Anne had served her purpose by proving that Henry's marriage to Catherine was the problem, not Henry's ability to father sons. Now, Henry was ready to try again with a different wife. Anne's trial was a foregone conclusion. She defended herself eloquently and maintained her innocence, but the outcome had been decided before the proceedings began. The court found her guilty of adultery, incest, and treason, all capital crimes. Anne Boleyn was executed on May 19, 1536, at the Tower of London. Henry had imported a skilled swordsman from France to ensure that her death would be quick and clean, a final gesture of respect, or perhaps guilt, toward the woman whose pursuit had changed English history. Anne's last speech before her execution was carefully crafted to protect her daughter Elizabeth. She proclaimed her loyalty to the king and expressed hope that he would prove to be a good and generous ruler. She couldn't proclaim her innocence without calling Henry's judgment into question, so she chose to remain diplomatically silent about the charges against her. But here's Anne Boleyn's real legacy. She gave England Elizabeth I, who would become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth's reign would see England emerge as a major European power, defeat the Spanish Armada, and experience a golden age of literature and exploration. Anne also played a crucial role in establishing England as a Protestant nation. Her influence on Henry's religious policies helped ensure that England's break with Rome became permanent rather than temporary. The Church of England that exists today can trace its origins directly back to Henry's desire to marry Anne Boleyn. Anne's execution marked a turning point in Henry's own character. The optimistic young king, who had believed that his personal desires aligned with God's will, was becoming a paranoid tyrant who saw enemies everywhere. Anne's fate showed everyone at court that Henry's love could turn to deadly hatred with terrifying speed. From this point forward, Henry's relationships with women would be marked by suspicion and calculation rather than passion. The romantic king, who had spent 6 years courting Anne Boleyn, was gone forever, replaced by a ruler who viewed wives as political instruments to be discarded when they stopped being useful. Anne Boleyn had gambled everything on her ability to give Henry a son, and she had lost. But in losing, she had changed England forever and given birth to a daughter who would prove that queens could rule just as effectively as kings. Now let's meet the woman who would benefit from Anne's tragedy, Jane Seymour, the quiet courtier who would finally give Henry the son he desperately wanted, only to pay for that gift with her life. After the drama and chaos of Anne Boleyn's rise and fall, Henry's third marriage seemed to promise something England desperately needed: stability. Jane Seymour appeared to be everything that Anne Boleyn wasn't: quiet, submissive, and focused entirely on being the perfect queen. But as we'll discover, Jane's story reveals just how dangerous it could be to give Henry exactly what he wanted. Jane Seymour came from a family that understood the game of Tudor court politics perfectly. The Seymours were established nobility, but not wealthy or powerful enough to be secure without royal favor. Jane's father, Sir John Seymour, and her brothers, Edward and Thomas, saw Jane's potential relationship with the king as their family's greatest opportunity for advancement. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had been educated abroad and exposed to international ideas, Jane was very much a product of traditional English nobility. She had been taught to be modest, obedient, and devoutly religious. Where Anne had been intellectually curious and politically engaged, Jane presented herself as someone who would never challenge royal authority or create controversy. This wasn't necessarily Jane's natural personality. It was a carefully crafted public persona designed to appeal to Henry after his traumatic experience with Anne. Jane and her family understood that Henry was now looking for a completely different type of wife, and they positioned Jane to meet those expectations perfectly. Jane had been serving as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, which means she had a front-row seat to the destruction of both marriages. She watched Catherine be discarded and humiliated. She watched Anne rise to unprecedented power and then be executed for failing to produce a male heir. Jane understood the lesson. Royal wives who caused problems or failed to deliver sons faced terrible consequences. Her strategy was to be so agreeable, so focused on Henry's needs, and so committed to traditional queenly virtues that Henry would never have reason to question her value. Henry began paying attention to Jane in early 1536, while Anne was still alive, but clearly falling out of favor. Jane's family encouraged this attention while being careful not to push too hard. They had seen what happened to Anne when she demanded too much, and they were determined to avoid making the same mistakes. Jane's approach to Henry's courtship was the opposite of Anne's. Where Anne had refused to sleep with Henry until he married her, Jane refused even to accept expensive gifts until she was properly married. When Henry sent her a purse full of gold coins, Jane returned it with a message that she hoped Henry would send such gifts only when God sends her some good fortune to have an honest husband. This response was brilliant political theater. Jane was positioning herself as morally superior to Anne, who had accepted gifts during their long courtship, while also making it clear that she expected marriage, not just royal attention. She managed to seem both modest and ambitious at the same time. Jane's family also supported her strategy by making themselves useful to Henry without being pushy. Edward Seymour, Jane's brother, was a competent military commander who could serve Henry's interests. Thomas Seymour was charming and politically skilled. The Seymours presented themselves as a family that could serve Henry loyally without causing the kinds of problems that the Boleyns had created. Henry and Jane were engaged within 24 hours of Anne Boleyn's execution. This shocking speed reveals something important about Henry's state of mind. He was desperate to move forward, to prove that Anne's execution had been necessary, and to start over with a wife who would finally give him the male heir he needed. The wedding took place on May 30th, 1536, just 11 days after Anne's execution. This wasn't the grand international spectacle that Henry's previous weddings had been. It was a quiet ceremony designed to emphasize continuity and stability rather than drama and change. Jane's motto as queen was, "Bound to obey and serve," which perfectly captured her public image. She would be the anti-Anne, traditional instead of radical, English instead of cosmopolitan, quiet instead of attention-seeking. Henry seemed genuinely relieved to have a wife who appeared to want nothing more than to serve his needs. Despite her image as a passive, traditional wife, Jane actually played a more significant political role than many people realize. She successfully negotiated for the restoration of Henry's daughter Mary to the royal household, something that required considerable diplomatic skill, given Henry's complicated feelings about his first marriage. Jane also intervened in the Pilgrimage of Grace, a major Catholic uprising in northern England in 1536. When rebels demanded the restoration of Catholic monasteries that Henry had dissolved, Jane reportedly knelt before Henry and begged him to restore the monasteries. Henry's response was telling. He reminded Jane of what had happened to Anne Boleyn when she meddled in politics, and Jane never again publicly challenged his policies. This incident reveals the impossible position that Henry's wives found themselves in. They were expected to be politically relevant enough to justify their position as queen, but not so politically active that they threatened Henry's authority. Jane learned to walk this tightrope more successfully than Anne had, but the threat was always there. In late 1536, Jane became pregnant, and the entire court held its breath. This pregnancy represented Henry's last, best hope for a legitimate male heir. Jane was young, healthy, and had already proven her fertility. If she couldn't give Henry a son, Henry would have to face the possibility that the problem might not be with his wives, but with himself. The pregnancy progressed normally through the summer of 1537, and preparations for the birth began on an unprecedented scale. Henry ordered physicians from across Europe to attend the birth. The royal nursery was prepared with the expectation that it would house the future King of England. As Jane's due date approached, Henry's anxiety became almost unbearable. He had been disappointed twice before, first with Catherine's series of pregnancy losses, then with Anne's failure to produce a surviving son. He couldn't afford to be disappointed again, and everyone around him understood the stakes. On October 12, 1537, after a difficult labor that lasted several days, Jane gave birth to a son. The child was named Edward, and his birth was celebrated throughout England as proof that God had finally blessed Henry's marriage. Henry's joy was overwhelming. After nearly 30 years of marriage and dozens of pregnancy attempts, he finally had the legitimate male heir he had desperately wanted. Edward's birth seemed to vindicate every controversial decision Henry had made: the break with Rome, the execution of Anne Boleyn, the dissolution of the monasteries. The celebrations were magnificent. Bonfires were lit across England, church bells rang for days, and Henry ordered a Te Deum sung in every church in the kingdom. Foreign ambassadors sent congratulations to their home countries, and Henry's international prestige reached new heights. For Jane personally, Edward's birth was the ultimate triumph. She had succeeded where Catherine and Anne had failed. She had given England its future king and secured her own position as the mother of Henry's heir. For a brief moment, everything seemed perfect, but Jane's triumph was short-lived. Within days of Edward's birth, Jane developed what was probably puerperal sepsis, a bacterial infection that was a common cause of death for women in childbirth during this period. In an era before antibiotics, such infections were often fatal. Jane's condition deteriorated rapidly. Henry, who had been euphoric about Edward's birth, now faced the possibility of losing the wife who had finally given him what he wanted most. The irony was cruel. Jane might die not because she had failed as a wife, but because she had succeeded too well. Henry's reaction to Jane's illness reveals something important about his feelings for her. Unlike his previous wives, Jane had never disappointed him or created political problems for him. She had given him a son and asked for nothing in return except the right to serve him faithfully. As she lay dying, Henry seems to have genuinely grieved for her as a person, not just as a political asset. Jane Seymour died on October 24, 1537, just 12 days after giving birth to Edward. Her death was devastating for Henry, who had finally found a wife who seemed perfect for his needs, only to lose her through no fault of her own or his. Jane's funeral was magnificent, befitting the mother of England's heir. But more importantly for understanding Henry's psychology, Jane became the wife he remembered most fondly. She was the only one of his 6 wives who never disappointed him, never challenged him, and never had to be discarded. In Henry's mind, Jane became the perfect wife, loving, obedient, and tragically taken from him by fate rather than by her own failures. Henry chose to be buried next to Jane when he died, rather than next to any of his other wives. This decision speaks volumes about how he viewed their relationship. Jane represented what Henry had always wanted in a marriage: complete devotion, political stability, and successful reproduction. Jane Seymour's greatest legacy was obviously her son Edward, who would become Edward VI and rule England as a Protestant king. But Jane's impact on Henry was equally significant. Her death reinforced Henry's belief that his personal happiness was always temporary and that he couldn't trust anyone completely. The Henry who had waited 6 years to marry Anne Boleyn was gone forever. The Henry who emerged from Jane's death was harder, more calculating, and more willing to view marriage as a purely practical arrangement, rather than a relationship that might bring personal fulfillment. Jane also established a template for how Henry's future wives should behave. They should be modest, obedient, and focused entirely on serving Henry's needs, rather than pursuing their own interests. This template would influence how Henry approached his remaining 3 marriages, though none of his subsequent wives would be able to match Jane's combination of success and tragedy. Jane Seymour created an impossible standard for Henry's future wives. She had given him a son and died before she could disappoint him in any way. How could any living woman compete with a perfect memory? This is the cruel irony of Jane's story. By being everything Henry wanted in a wife, and by dying before that perfection could be tarnished by the realities of long-term marriage, Jane made it almost impossible for Henry to be satisfied with anyone else. As we'll see with Henry's next 3 wives, they would all be measured against Jane's example and found wanting, not because they were failures as wives, but because they were alive, human, and therefore inevitably flawed in ways that Jane's memory could never be. Now let's meet the woman who would learn this lesson the hard way. Anne of Cleves, the German princess who would survive her marriage to Henry by being clever enough to give him exactly what he needed: a way out. By 1539, Henry VIII found himself in a dangerous international position. His break with Rome had made him enemies of the 2 most powerful Catholic rulers in Europe, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and Francis I of France. For the first time in decades, these traditional enemies were considering putting aside their differences to launch a joint invasion of Protestant England. Henry desperately needed allies, and the most obvious source of support was the German Protestant princes who had also rejected papal authority. A marriage alliance with one of these Protestant rulers could provide England with the military support it needed to survive a Catholic invasion. This is where Anne of Cleves enters our story, not as a romantic interest for Henry, but as a diplomatic solution to England's international isolation. Anne was the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, a German territory that was strategically located and politically significant in the complex world of 16th century European politics. The Duchy of Cleves controlled important territories along the Rhine River and had recently aligned itself with Protestant forces against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. Anne had been raised to be a political asset for her family. Like most noble daughters of her era, her education had focused on domestic skills, basic literacy, and the social graces necessary for making a good marriage alliance. She could read and write in German, but she knew no Latin, French, or English, languages that were essential for sophisticated court conversation. What made Anne attractive as a marriage candidate wasn't her personal qualities, but her family's political position. An alliance with Cleves would give England access to German military support and would signal to other Protestant powers that England was a reliable ally in their struggle against Catholic Europe. Since Henry couldn't meet Anne in person before committing to the marriage, he had to rely on painted portraits and diplomatic reports to evaluate her suitability. Henry sent Hans Holbein the Younger, one of Europe's greatest portrait artists, to paint Anne's likeness. Holbein's portrait of Anne shows an attractive, dignified woman wearing rich clothing and jewelry. The painting emphasized Anne's status and wealth rather than trying to make her appear romantically alluring. This was diplomatic art, designed to show that Anne was an appropriate consort for a king, rather than to capture her personality or individual appeal. Henry also received detailed reports about Anne's character and behavior from his ambassadors. These reports emphasized Anne's modesty, her Protestant faith, and her suitability as a royal wife. What they didn't mention, probably because nobody thought it was important, was whether Anne and Henry would have any personal compatibility. The negotiations for Henry's marriage to Anne were entirely political. The discussions focused on military alliances, trade agreements, and the balance of power in Northern Europe, rather than personal compatibility or romantic attraction. Henry's negotiators secured what seemed like excellent terms. Anne would bring a substantial dowry. Cleves would provide military support if England were invaded, and the marriage would formalize the Protestant alliance that Henry needed to survive in an increasingly hostile Catholic Europe. But there was a crucial element missing from these negotiations: any consideration of whether Henry and Anne would actually like each other. Everyone involved seemed to assume that personal compatibility was irrelevant as long as the political benefits were sufficient. Anne arrived in England in December 1539, and Henry's reaction to meeting her in person was immediate and catastrophic. Whatever he had expected based on Holbein's portrait and his ambassador's reports, the reality was completely different. The problem wasn't necessarily that Anne was unattractive. Contemporary descriptions suggest she was reasonably pretty, though not spectacularly beautiful. The issue was that Henry felt he had been deceived. The woman he met didn't match the image he had formed from the portrait and diplomatic reports. More importantly, Henry and Anne had absolutely no personal chemistry. Anne spoke no English, Henry spoke no German, and they had to communicate through interpreters. Anne's education and interests were completely different from what Henry expected in a sophisticated queen. Where Henry's previous wives had been able to engage him intellectually and socially, Anne seemed foreign and unsophisticated. Henry's reaction to meeting Anne was so negative that he immediately began looking for ways to escape the marriage. He complained to his advisors that he had been tricked, that Anne was not as attractive as her portrait had suggested, and that he could never bring himself to consummate the marriage. But here's where Henry discovered the limitations of his own power. The marriage alliance with Cleves had already been publicly announced. Anne was already in England, and her family was expecting the wedding to proceed as planned. Backing out now would be a diplomatic disaster that could destroy England's credibility with potential Protestant allies. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had negotiated the Cleves marriage, found himself in an impossible position. He had secured the alliance that England needed for survival, but his king was refusing to go through with his part of the bargain. Henry and Anne were married on January 6, 1540, in what must have been one of the most awkward royal weddings in English history. Henry went through the ceremony because he had to, but everyone present could see that his heart wasn't in it. The wedding night was reportedly a disaster. Henry later claimed that he had been unable to consummate the marriage due to his physical revulsion toward Anne. Whether this was true, or whether Henry was simply creating a legal justification for a future annulment, it established the pattern for their entire brief marriage. From the beginning, Henry treated Anne more like an unwelcome houseguest than like his wife. They had separate households, rarely appeared together in public, and never developed anything resembling a normal marital relationship. Here's where Anne of Cleves showed remarkable intelligence and political skill. She could have fought Henry's obvious desire to end their marriage, as Catherine of Aragon had done. She could have tried to assert her rights as queen and demanded that Henry fulfill his marital obligations. Instead, Anne chose a completely different strategy. She recognized that Henry was desperately unhappy with their marriage and that fighting him would only make her situation worse. Rather than becoming another Catherine of Aragon, defending a marriage that one party desperately wanted to escape, Anne decided to make herself as agreeable as possible to Henry's desire for an annulment. This wasn't just passive acceptance, it was brilliant political calculation. Anne understood that her best chance for a comfortable future lay in making Henry grateful to her for solving his problem, rather than angry with her for creating additional problems. By the summer of 1540, Henry was actively seeking an annulment of his marriage to Anne, and Anne was cooperating fully with his efforts. She agreed to testify that their marriage had never been consummated, which provided the legal grounds Henry needed to declare the marriage invalid. Anne also agreed to the fiction that she had been pre-contracted to marry someone else before her marriage to Henry, which provided additional legal justification for the annulment. None of this was true, but Anne understood that helping Henry save face was more important than defending the technical truth. In exchange for her cooperation, Anne negotiated an extremely generous settlement. Henry granted her a substantial income for life, gave her several beautiful properties, and allowed her to remain in England with the honorary title of the King's beloved sister. The annulment was finalized in July 1540. After just 6 months of marriage, Anne had gone from being Queen of England to being Henry's sister. But in practical terms, this was actually a much better position than she could have expected. Anne lived comfortably on Henry's generous settlement for the rest of her life. She learned to speak English, developed friendships at court, and became a popular figure in English society. She outlived Henry and remained in England through the reigns of Edward VI, Mary I, and into the early years of Elizabeth I. Most importantly, Anne had avoided the terrible fates that befell several of Henry's other wives. She kept her head by being smart enough to give Henry what he wanted, rather than fighting for what she was technically entitled to. Anne's annulment had serious political consequences beyond her personal situation. Thomas Cromwell, who had negotiated the Cleves marriage, became a scapegoat for Henry's unhappiness with the alliance. Henry needed someone to blame for the diplomatic embarrassment, and Cromwell was the obvious target. Cromwell was executed in July 1540, on the same day that Henry's annulment from Anne was finalized, and the same day that Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. The timing was symbolic. Henry was clearing away all reminders of his diplomatic mistake and starting fresh with a new wife and new advisors. Anne of Cleves proved that it was possible to survive marriage to Henry VIII by being intelligent, flexible, and willing to prioritize practical considerations over personal pride. Her example would influence how other women approached relationships with dangerous, powerful men throughout the Tudor period. Anne also demonstrated the limitations of portrait diplomacy and long-distance marriage negotiations. Her marriage to Henry showed that political compatibility wasn't enough to sustain a royal marriage. There needed to be at least some personal connection between the partners. Anne's story reveals something important about Henry's character development by this point in his reign. The young Henry, who had pursued Anne Boleyn for 6 years, was gone forever. The middle-aged Henry was unwilling to invest time and effort in developing relationships with women who didn't immediately appeal to him. This impatience would have serious consequences for Henry's next wife, Catherine Howard, who would discover that Henry's capacity for forgiveness and understanding had been severely diminished by his previous marital disappointments. Anne of Cleves had the intelligence to recognize this change in Henry's character and to adapt her behavior accordingly. She understood that survival required giving Henry what he wanted, rather than trying to change his mind about what he should want. As we'll see, not all of Henry's wives were as perceptive about the realities of marriage to an increasingly paranoid and unpredictable king. Now let's meet Catherine Howard, the young woman who would learn too late that Henry's capacity for love had become inseparable from his capacity for destruction. Catherine Howard's story is the most tragic of all Henry VIII's marriages, and not just because it ended with her execution. Catherine was barely out of her teens when she married Henry, and her story reveals the darkest aspects of Tudor court politics. How young women could be used as pawns in powerful families' political games, and how Henry's increasing paranoia had made him genuinely dangerous to be around. Catherine Howard came from one of England's most powerful noble families, but she wasn't raised with the advantages that her family name might suggest. Catherine was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the Duke of Norfolk, who had little money despite his prestigious connections. Catherine's childhood was spent largely in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. This might sound like a privileged upbringing, but the reality was quite different. The Dowager Duchess's household was overcrowded with young relatives who received minimal supervision and education. This lack of proper supervision would have tragic consequences for Catherine. While she was living in the Dowager Duchess's household, Catherine became involved in sexual relationships with older men, first with her music teacher, Henry Mannix, and later with Francis Derham, a gentleman in the household who may have considered himself to be married to Catherine through a form of informal contract. These relationships weren't unusual for the time period. Young people in noble households often had romantic entanglements that their elders chose to ignore. But they would later be used as evidence against Catherine when she became queen. Catherine arrived at court around 1539 when she was probably 18 or 19 years old. She came as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, which means she had a front-row seat to Henry's growing dissatisfaction with his fourth marriage. Catherine was considered one of the most beautiful women at court. Contemporary descriptions emphasize her youth, her vivacity, and her ability to charm everyone she met. Unlike Anne of Cleves, who seemed foreign and sophisticated, Catherine appeared fresh, English, and uncomplicated. The Howard family, led by Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, saw Catherine's beauty and Henry's obvious attraction to her as their opportunity to regain political influence. The Howards had been temporarily sidelined after Anne Boleyn's execution, since Anne had also been a Howard family member. Catherine represented their chance to get back into Henry's good graces. Henry's attraction to Catherine was immediate and overwhelming. Remember, Henry was now 49 years old, increasingly overweight due to a leg injury that limited his mobility, and dealing with the humiliation of his failed marriage to Anne of Cleves. Catherine represented everything Henry felt he was losing: youth, beauty, and sexual vitality. But there was something almost desperate about Henry's pursuit of Catherine. This wasn't the confident courtship of a powerful king. This was the behavior of an aging man trying to recapture his youth through a relationship with a much younger woman. Henry showered Catherine with gifts and attention in a way that must have been overwhelming for a young woman who had never been the center of such intense focus. He gave her lands, jewels, and expensive clothes. More importantly, he gave her access to a level of power and influence that she had never experienced before. Henry married Catherine on July 28, 1540, the same day that his annulment from Anne of Cleves was finalized, and the same day that Thomas Cromwell was executed. The timing reveals Henry's state of mind. He was clearing away all reminders of his recent failures and starting completely fresh with a young, beautiful wife who seemed to represent a new beginning. The early months of Henry and Catherine's marriage appear to have been happy, at least from Henry's perspective. He was rejuvenated by his relationship with Catherine and seemed to believe that he had finally found the perfect combination of beauty, youth, and fertility that would give him additional male heirs and restore his confidence in his own masculinity. Catherine, for her part, seems to have been overwhelmed by her sudden elevation to queenship. She was now one of the most powerful women in Europe, but she had received no preparation for handling that kind of responsibility and pressure. Catherine's downfall began with a series of poor decisions that revealed her youth and inexperience. First, she appointed several people from her past to positions in her household, including Francis Derham, the man she had been involved with before coming to court. This decision was incredibly naive. Catherine seems to have thought she was being loyal to old friends, but she was actually bringing potential problems directly into the royal household. Derham knew about Catherine's sexual past, which gave him dangerous leverage over the Queen. Even more destructively, Catherine began a relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of Henry's privy chamber. Culpeper was young, attractive, and charming, everything that Henry was no longer. Their relationship may or may not have been sexual, but it was certainly romantic and conducted in secret. Catherine and Culpeper exchanged letters and met privately, often with the help of Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, the widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother. These meetings were incredibly dangerous. Any secret relationship involving the Queen could be considered treasonous, and Catherine was risking her life for what appears to have been an immature infatuation. Catherine's past and present relationships were discovered in late 1541 when a former servant named John Lascelles came forward with information about Catherine's relationships before her marriage to Henry. Lascelles may have been motivated by religious or political concerns, or he may simply have been settling a personal grudge. Once Henry's investigators began looking into Catherine's past, the full scope of her relationships became clear. They discovered her involvement with Henry Manox and Francis Derham before her marriage, and they uncovered evidence of her ongoing relationship with Thomas Culpeper. During her marriage to Henry, Henry's reaction to these discoveries was devastating. The king, who had been rejuvenated by his marriage to Catherine, now felt utterly betrayed and humiliated. He had believed that Catherine's youth and innocence made her different from his previous wives, and the discovery that she had been deceiving him triggered a level of rage that surprised even his experienced courtiers. The charges against Catherine were serious: concealing her past relationships from Henry before their marriage, and conducting an adulterous relationship with Thomas Culpeper during their marriage. Under the laws of the time, both of these actions could be considered treasonous because they potentially threatened the legitimacy of any children Catherine might have with Henry. But beyond the legal charges, Henry seems to have taken Catherine's behavior as a personal attack on his masculinity and his judgment. He had believed that Catherine loved him for himself, and the discovery that she preferred younger men made him feel foolish and vulnerable. Henry's reaction was so extreme that his courtiers became genuinely worried about his mental state. He alternated between rage and self-pity, at one point breaking down in tears during a council meeting as he spoke about Catherine's betrayal. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were executed in December 1541. Culpeper, as a gentleman who had betrayed his king's trust, was beheaded. Derham, who was considered to be of lower social status, was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a much more brutal form of execution. Catherine herself was kept in confinement while Henry decided what to do with her. Initially, there was some hope that Henry might show mercy due to Catherine's youth and the influence of her family. But Henry's anger was too deep, and his paranoia about being deceived was too strong. In February 1542, Parliament passed a bill of attainder declaring Catherine guilty of treason. Catherine was executed on February 13th, 1542, at the Tower of London. She was probably only 20 or 21 years old. Catherine's behavior in her final days reveals both her youth and her courage. Initially, she was hysterical when she learned she would be executed, but by the time of her death, she had composed herself and faced her fate with dignity. Legend says that Catherine requested a block be brought to her cell so she could practice laying her head on it properly. Whether this story is true or not, it captures something important about Catherine's final days. she was trying to prepare herself for an experience that no one her age should have had to face. Catherine's last words reportedly focused on her acceptance of her fate and her prayers for Henry's happiness. Like Anne Boleyn before her, Catherine was careful not to say anything that might be interpreted as criticism of the king who had ordered her death. Catherine Howard's execution marked another turning point in Henry's reign. This was the second wife he had executed, and the pattern was becoming clear. Henry's love could transform into deadly hatred with terrifying speed, and his increasingly paranoid nature made him dangerous to anyone who disappointed him. The Catherine Howard affair also revealed the impossible position of young women in Tudor court politics. Catherine had been used by her family as a political tool, but when their strategy backfired, she was the one who paid the ultimate price. After Catherine's execution, Henry became noticeably more reclusive and suspicious. The optimistic young king, who had believed in love and marriage, was gone forever, replaced by a man who viewed all relationships as potentially threatening and who was quick to see betrayal even in innocent actions. Catherine's fate also sent a clear message to anyone considering involvement with Henry. The king's favor was dangerous because it could disappear at any moment, and when it did, the consequences could be fatal. Catherine Howard's story serves as a tragic reminder of how young women could become victims of the political ambitions of powerful men in Tudor England. She was barely out of her teens when she was thrust into a position she was completely unprepared for, and she paid the ultimate price for mistakes that were largely the result of her youth and inexperience. Catherine's execution also marked the end of Henry's romantic illusions about marriage. His final wife, Catherine Parr, would have to navigate a relationship with a king who had learned to view wives as potential enemies rather than partners. Now let's meet the woman who would manage this impossible challenge, Catherine Parr, the intellectual survivor who would outlive Henry VIII and prove that it was possible to be married to one of history's most dangerous kings and live to tell about it. Imagine being asked to marry a man who had already executed 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and driven one into exile and early death. That was the situation Catherine Parr faced in 1543 when Henry VIII decided she should become his 6th and final wife. Catherine's story is one of intelligence, courage, and survival against impossible odds. Catherine Parr was different from Henry's previous wives in several crucial ways. First, she was a widow twice over, which gave her a level of experience and independence that Henry's younger wives had lacked. She had been married to Edward Burrough, who died in 1533, and then to John Neville, Lord Latimer, who died in 1543. More importantly, Catherine was highly educated and intellectually curious. She spoke French, Latin, and Italian fluently, and she was deeply interested in religious reform and humanist philosophy. Catherine wasn't just literate. She was a serious scholar who would later become the first woman to publish a book under her own name in English. Catherine's education and experience as a widow had given her something that Henry's other wives had lacked: the confidence and skill to manage powerful men without being overwhelmed by them. She understood how to be diplomatically supportive while maintaining her own intellectual independence. When Henry began pursuing Catherine in 1543, she was already in love with Thomas Seymour, the brother of Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. Catherine and Thomas had been conducting a courtship and were probably planning to marry when Henry's interest became known. Catherine faced an impossible choice. She couldn't refuse the king's marriage proposal without risking serious consequences for herself and her family. But accepting meant giving up her chance at a marriage based on mutual affection and entering into a relationship with a man who had become increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Catherine later wrote that she accepted Henry's proposal as a matter of duty rather than inclination. She understood that refusing would be seen as treason, and she also seems to have convinced herself that God wanted her to serve as queen for some greater purpose. Henry and Catherine were married on July 12, 1543, in a private ceremony at Hampton Court Palace. This was a very different kind of wedding from Henry's previous marriages. There was no international fanfare, no grand celebrations, and no pretense that this was a romantic union. Both parties understood that this was a practical arrangement designed to meet Henry's needs for companionship and Catherine's need for survival. Catherine approached her role as Henry's sixth wife with remarkable strategic intelligence. She had studied the fates of Henry's previous wives, and she understood what had worked and what had been fatal. From Catherine of Aragon, she learned the importance of remaining politically valuable. From Anne Boleyn, she learned the dangers of pushing too hard for religious reform. From Jane Seymour, she learned the value of appearing supportive and non-threatening. From Anne of Cleves, she learned that cooperation could be rewarded. From Catherine Howard, she learned that any appearance of deception could be fatal. One of Catherine's most significant achievements was successfully building relationships with Henry's three children from his previous marriages, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. This required extraordinary diplomatic skill because these relationships were complicated by the religious and political conflicts that had surrounded their mother's faiths. Mary, Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon, was a devout Catholic who resented the Protestant reforms that had destroyed her mother's marriage. Elizabeth, Henry's daughter with Anne Boleyn, was brilliant but cautious, having learned that her survival depended on avoiding political controversy. Edward, Henry's son with Jane Seymour, was being raised as a Protestant heir, but was still a child who needed stability and affection. Catherine managed to build genuine relationships with all three of Henry's children without favoring one over the others or getting caught up in the religious conflicts that divided them. She arranged for all three children to be brought back into the royal household and to be included in the line of succession, healing family divisions that had persisted for years. Despite the risks involved, Catherine continued her religious and intellectual activities as queen. She published devotional works, supported Protestant reformers, and maintained correspondence with leading humanist scholars across Europe. Catherine understood that Henry valued intelligence in his wives, but she was careful to present her scholarly activities as supportive of his policies, rather than as independent challenges to his authority. Catherine's book, Prayers or Meditations, became extremely popular and was reprinted multiple times during her lifetime. This made Catherine one of the most published women of her era and demonstrated that it was possible for a queen to have an intellectual life that extended beyond court politics. Catherine also used her position to protect Protestant reformers who were being persecuted during the conservative reaction of Henry's later years. She was careful to do this quietly and diplomatically, but she did use her influence to save lives and to keep the reform movement alive during a dangerous period. Catherine's religious activities nearly cost her everything in 1546. Conservative enemies at court, led by Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, convinced Henry that Catherine was becoming too involved in religious matters and was potentially challenging royal authority on theological questions. The conservatives prepared articles of impeachment against Catherine, and Henry signed a warrant for her arrest. Catherine discovered the plot just in time and realized that she was in mortal danger. Her response shows both her intelligence and her understanding of Henry's psychology. Instead of trying to defend her religious activities or to argue that she had done nothing wrong, Catherine threw herself on Henry's mercy and claimed that any theological discussions she had engaged in were merely attempts to learn from his superior wisdom. She positioned herself as a student seeking instruction rather than as an independent thinker with her own opinions. Catherine's response to the religious crisis of 1546 reveals her sophisticated understanding of how to manage Henry's increasingly paranoid and unpredictable behavior. She didn't try to argue with him or to justify her actions. Instead, she appealed to his ego and his desire to be seen as the ultimate authority on all matters. When Henry's guards came to arrest Catherine, they found her engaged in theological discussion with Henry himself, with Catherine taking the role of the eager student, listening to Henry's explanations. Henry dismissed the guards and never again seriously considered taking action against Catherine. This incident shows Catherine's remarkable psychological insight. She understood that Henry's anger toward his wives often stemmed from his feeling that they were challenging his authority or making him look foolish. By positioning herself as subordinate to his wisdom, Catherine removed the threat that he perceived in her intellectual activities. Catherine's marriage to Henry required her to serve as both wife and nurse to an increasingly ill and difficult man. By 1543, Henry was severely overweight, suffered from painful leg ulcers that may have been caused by diabetes, and was often in considerable physical discomfort. Henry's physical condition affected his mental state, making him more irritable, suspicious, and prone to violent outbursts. Catherine had to navigate not just the normal challenges of being married to a king, but also the specific difficulties of being married to a man whose health was deteriorating and whose temper was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Catherine managed this challenge by becoming genuinely useful to Henry in ways that went beyond the traditional roles of a royal wife. She served as his secretary, helping him with correspondence and administrative tasks. She acted as a diplomatic hostess when foreign ambassadors visited court. Most importantly, she provided the kind of intelligent companionship that Henry had always valued in his relationships with women. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, and Catherine's reaction reveals something important about their relationship. While she performed the expected rituals of royal mourning, Catherine also moved quickly to secure her independence and to pursue the relationship with Thomas Seymour that she had been forced to abandon when Henry decided to marry her. Catherine and Thomas Seymour were secretly married within a few months of Henry's death, suggesting that their previous romantic attachment had survived Catherine's strategic marriage to the king. This marriage caused considerable scandal because Catherine hadn't observed the traditional period of royal mourning, but it also represented Catherine's determination to finally have a relationship based on mutual affection rather than political necessity. Catherine's marriage to Thomas Seymour was brief but apparently happy. She became pregnant in 1548 at age 36 and gave birth to a daughter named Mary. Tragically, Catherine died from complications of childbirth just a few days after her daughter was born. Catherine's death was genuinely mourned by Henry's children, particularly Elizabeth, who had developed a close relationship with her stepmother. Elizabeth later said that Catherine had been more of a mother to her than Anne Boleyn, whom Elizabeth barely remembered. Catherine Parr's greatest achievement was surviving marriage to Henry VIII, but that survival required extraordinary intelligence, courage, and diplomatic skill. She managed to maintain her intellectual independence while appearing completely supportive of Henry's authority. She healed family divisions that had persisted for years. She protected Protestant reformers during a period of religious persecution, and she demonstrated that it was possible for a woman to be both a scholar and a queen. Catherine also established important precedents for future royal women. She showed that queens could be intellectually active and could publish their own works. She demonstrated that stepmothers could play important roles in royal families, and she proved that survival in dangerous political circumstances required not just luck, but careful strategy and psychological insight. Catherine Parr's death in 1548 marked the end of the Tudor marriage saga that had begun nearly 40 years earlier when Henry first married Catherine of Aragon. Through 6 marriages, Henry had sought the perfect combination of political advantage, personal compatibility, and reproductive success. He had found elements of what he wanted in each of his wives, but he had never found everything he needed in a single relationship. Catherine Parr came closer than any of Henry's other wives to providing him with a successful partnership. She gave him companionship without drama, intellectual stimulation without challenge, and family harmony without political complications. If Henry had been a different kind of man, or if Catherine had married him earlier in his reign, their relationship might have developed into something genuinely fulfilling for both of them. Instead, Catherine's story stands as a testament to the possibility of survival and even success in impossible circumstances. She showed that intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking could triumph over even the most dangerous political situations. Now, as we conclude our journey through Henry VIII's 6 marriages, let's examine what these relationships reveal about power, politics, and human nature in one of history's most fascinating periods. Henry VIII's 6 marriages weren't just personal relationships. They were the driving force behind some of the most dramatic changes in English and European history. Every wedding, every annulment, every execution sent shockwaves through the political and religious landscape of the 16th century. Today, let's examine how one king's obsession with finding the perfect wife ended up reshaping Western civilization. The most obvious consequence of Henry's marriages was the English Reformation. Henry's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon led directly to England's break with the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England with the king as its supreme head. This wasn't just a religious change. It was a complete transformation of English society. For nearly 1,000 years, England had been part of Catholic Europe, with the Pope as the ultimate spiritual authority. Henry's break with Rome isolated England from the Catholic powers of Europe, but also freed England from papal interference in English politics. The creation of the Church of England had massive economic consequences. Henry dissolved the monasteries and seized their vast landholdings, which he then sold to raise money for his government and to reward his supporters. This transfer of land from the church to private owners created a new class of wealthy landowners who had a vested interest in maintaining the Protestant settlement. Henry's marriages also established important precedents about royal authority and the limits of that authority. Henry claimed the right to determine not just England's political policies, but also its religious beliefs. He argued that kings derived their authority directly from God, and that no earthly power, including the Pope, could override royal decisions. This expansion of royal authority had long-lasting consequences. Future English monarchs would claim many of the same powers that Henry had asserted, and the idea that the monarch was the supreme head of the English Church would continue into the modern era. But Henry's marriages also revealed the limits of royal power. Despite his claims to absolute authority, Henry couldn't simply do whatever he wanted. He needed Parliament to validate his annulments and his religious policies. He needed the support of powerful nobles to maintain his position. And he discovered that international opinion mattered, even for a king who claimed to be answerable only to God. Henry's 6 wives and their various fates had a profound impact on how Tudor society viewed royal women and women's roles more generally. The dramatic rise and fall of figures like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard showed that women could achieve enormous power and influence, but also that this power was always precarious and dependent on male approval. At the same time, women like Catherine of Aragon and Catherine Parr demonstrated that it was possible for women to be politically significant in their own right. Catherine of Aragon's resistance to Henry's annulment showed that women could challenge royal authority when they believed they were defending important principles. Catherine Parr's scholarly activities showed that women could be intellectually serious and could contribute to theological and political debates. Henry's daughter Elizabeth, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs, learned important lessons from observing her father's marriages. Elizabeth understood both the power and the danger of marriage for royal women, and her decision to remain unmarried was influenced by her observation of how marriage had complicated and ultimately destroyed the lives of many of the women in her father's life. Henry's marriages had significant impacts on European politics and diplomacy. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had cemented the English alliance with Spain. His pursuit of Anne Boleyn had broken that alliance and pushed England toward an anti-imperial foreign policy. His brief marriage to Anne of Cleves had represented an attempt to build Protestant alliances in Northern Europe. These shifting alliances, driven by Henry's personal relationships, helped to reshape the balance of power in 16th century Europe. England's break with the Catholic Church aligned it with Protestant powers against the Catholic alliance of France and the Holy Roman Empire. This religious divide would influence European politics for centuries. Henry's marriages also established England as a significant player in European marriage diplomacy. Future English monarchs would continue to use royal marriages as tools of foreign policy, and European powers would have to consider England's marriage policies when planning their own diplomatic strategies. Henry's marriages raised important questions about the relationship between royal personal life and public policy that would continue to influence English constitutional development. Henry had claimed the right to reshape England's religious and political institutions to accommodate his personal desires. But this raised questions about the limits of royal power and the rights of subjects to resist royal policies they disagreed with. The English Civil War of the 17th century, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the gradual development of constitutional monarchy can all be traced back to questions about royal authority that were first raised during Henry's reign. Henry's assertion that he could override traditional authority structures when they conflicted with his personal needs established precedents that future generations would have to grapple with. The Church of England that Henry created to solve his marriage problems evolved in ways that Henry never intended or expected. Henry had wanted to maintain Catholic theology while rejecting papal authority, but the Protestant ideas that had influenced reformers like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Parr continued to develop after Henry's death. Under Henry's son, Edward VI, England moved in a more distinctly Protestant direction. Under his daughter Mary, there was a violent attempt to restore Catholicism. Under his daughter Elizabeth, a moderate Protestant settlement was established that tried to accommodate different religious viewpoints while maintaining the essential structure that Henry had created. This religious evolution shows how personal decisions can have unintended long-term consequences. Henry's break with Rome, motivated by his desire to remarry, ultimately led to religious changes that went far beyond anything Henry had originally intended. Henry's marriages had dramatic impacts on the noble families who became connected to the royal family through marriage. The Boleyn family rose to unprecedented heights when Anne became queen, then fell into disgrace when she was executed. The Seymour family gained enormous influence when Jane became queen and gave birth to Edward VI. The Howard family saw their fortunes rise and fall multiple times depending on Henry's relationship with their various female relatives. These dramatic changes in family fortunes created a court culture that was both more dynamic and more dangerous than it had been in previous reigns. Ambitious families understood that royal marriage could elevate them to the highest levels of society, but they also understood that royal disfavor could be fatal. The constant turnover in Henry's marriages also created a court culture that was marked by intrigue, suspicion, and rapid changes in political alliances. Courtiers learned to be careful about their associations and to be prepared to distance themselves from former allies who fell out of royal favor. Henry's marriages established important precedents about how royal marriages should be conducted and what purposes they should serve. The dramatic publicity surrounding Henry's marriages showed that royal romantic relationships were legitimate subjects of public interest and political debate. Henry's willingness to end marriages that didn't serve his political needs established precedents that would influence royal marriage policies for centuries. Future monarchs would continue to view marriage primarily as a tool of diplomacy and dynastic politics, rather than as a personal relationship based on mutual affection. At the same time, the disasters that befell several of Henry's wives showed that royal marriages carried serious risks for the women involved. This awareness would influence how noble families approached royal marriage negotiations and how royal women navigated their relationships with powerful husbands. Henry's marriages became the subject of countless books, plays, films, and television shows that continue to fascinate audiences today. The dramatic stories of Anne Boleyn's rise and fall, Catherine of Aragon's dignified resistance, and Catherine Howard's tragic youth have become part of English cultural mythology. This cultural fascination with Henry's marriages reflects their broader significance as stories about power, ambition, love, and betrayal that resonate across different historical periods. Henry's marriages provide a window into the human costs of political power and the ways that personal relationships can become entangled with historical forces. Perhaps the greatest irony of Henry's obsessive pursuit of the perfect marriage is that his most significant historical legacy came through his daughter Elizabeth, whose decision never to marry was directly influenced by her observation of her father's marital disasters. Elizabeth I became one of England's greatest monarchs by choosing to remain single and to avoid the complications that marriage had brought to her father's reign. In a sense, Henry's failed quest for marital happiness ended up demonstrating that royal power and personal happiness might be fundamentally incompatible. Elizabeth's successful reign showed that the male heir Henry had desperately sought wasn't actually necessary for effective royal rule. The daughter that Henry had been disappointed to receive from Anne Boleyn proved to be a more capable ruler than the son he had been so desperate to have. Now, as we conclude this journey through Henry VIII's complex personal life, let's reflect on what these stories can teach us about power, human nature, and the unpredictable ways that personal decisions can reshape history. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the complex, dramatic, and often tragic personal life of Henry VIII. We've met 6 remarkable women, witnessed the birth of the Church of England, and seen how one king's desperate search for the perfect marriage ended up changing the course of Western civilization. But what can we actually learn from this incredible story? What does Henry VIII's obsession with marriage and succession tell us about power, human nature, and the unintended consequences of our personal decisions? First, and most importantly, Henry's story shows us the human cost of absolute power. Henry began his reign as an intelligent, charismatic young king with everything going for him. He had a stable throne, a wealthy kingdom, and the respect of other European rulers. He seemed to have unlimited potential. But Henry's belief that his personal desires and God's will were the same thing gradually corrupted his judgment and his character. The young king, who had genuinely seemed to love Catherine of Aragon, became the paranoid tyrant who could order the execution of Anne Boleyn. The romantic prince who had written love letters to Anne Boleyn became the cold politician who could destroy Catherine Howard. Power didn't just corrupt Henry, it isolated him from reality and made it impossible for him to form genuine relationships with other people. By the end of his life, Henry couldn't trust anyone completely because he had learned to view all relationships as potentially threatening to his authority. Henry's marriages also revealed the limits of human control over our own lives. Despite being one of the most powerful men in Europe, Henry couldn't control the things that mattered most to him. He couldn't force his wives to have sons. He couldn't make other people love him the way he wanted to be loved. He couldn't prevent the political consequences of his personal decisions. Henry's desperate attempts to control his personal life actually made his life more chaotic and unpredictable. Each marriage was supposed to solve his problems, but each marriage created new complications that he hadn't anticipated. His pursuit of the perfect wife led to religious revolution, international conflict, and personal tragedy. But if Henry's story shows us the dangers of absolute power, his wives' stories show us the remarkable strength of the human spirit in impossible circumstances. Catherine of Aragon's refusal to disappear quietly when it would have been easier to comply. Anne Boleyn's courage in defending herself at her trial, even when she knew the outcome was predetermined. Jane Seymour's grace under the enormous pressure of finally giving Henry a son. Anne of Cleves's intelligence in turning a personal disaster into a comfortable life. Catherine Howard's dignity in facing execution while still a teenager. Catherine Parr's skill in surviving marriage to one of history's most dangerous men. Each of these women found ways to maintain their dignity, their principles, or their survival in circumstances that would have broken many people. They show us that even when we can't control our circumstances, we can still control how we respond to those circumstances. Perhaps most fascinatingly, Henry's story shows us how personal decisions can have massive unintended consequences. Henry's decision to pursue Anne Boleyn was motivated by personal attraction and his desire for a son. He probably never intended to create a new church, transform English society, or establish precedents that would influence constitutional development for centuries. But that's exactly what happened. Henry's personal choices became historical forces that reshaped not just England, but the entire Protestant world. His marriages influenced everything from international diplomacy to religious theology, to women's rights, to constitutional law. This reminds us that we never know which of our personal decisions might have broader consequences. The choices we make in our private lives can end up influencing other people, future generations, and historical developments in ways we never anticipated. Henry's 6 marriages also offer some surprisingly relevant lessons about relationships and human nature. Henry's pattern of idealizing new partners, becoming disappointed when they didn't meet his unrealistic expectations, and then blaming them for his disappointment, is something that many people can recognize in their own lives, or in the lives of people they know. Henry's inability to take responsibility for his own role in his marital failures, his tendency to view his partners as either perfect or worthless, and his belief that finding the right person would solve all his problems are relationship patterns that still exist today. The difference, of course, is that Henry had the power to execute wives who disappointed him, while most of us have to learn healthier ways of dealing with relationship conflicts. But the underlying psychological patterns are remarkably familiar. You might be wondering why any of this matters today. After all, we live in a democratic age where no single person has the kind of absolute power that Henry wielded. We don't execute people for adultery, we don't break up churches over marriage disputes, and we generally try to separate personal relationships from political decisions. But Henry's story is still relevant because it shows us what happens when personal psychology and political power intersect in dangerous ways. We still see leaders who believe that their personal desires reflect the will of God or the needs of their people. We still see people who use their power to silence critics, punish enemies, and avoid accountability for their actions. Henry's story reminds us why checks and balances, accountability, and the rule of law are so important. It shows us why we should be suspicious of leaders who claim that their personal interests align perfectly with the public good. If you've made it this far in this video, you're clearly someone who appreciates the complexity and relevance of historical stories. You understand that the past isn't just a collection of interesting facts. It's a source of insights about human nature, political power, and the forces that shape our world. I want to encourage you to keep exploring these connections between historical events and contemporary issues. Look for patterns in how power operates, how people respond to impossible circumstances, and how personal decisions can have unintended consequences. This deep dive into Henry VIII's marriages is just one example of how historical stories can illuminate broader truths about human nature and political power. If you enjoyed this analysis, make sure to subscribe to the channel because we'll be exploring more fascinating historical figures and events through the same lens of understanding the human stories behind the historical forces. Next week, we're going to examine another fascinating royal figure whose personal life changed history, Cleopatra VII of Egypt, whose relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony shaped the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. You won't want to miss that analysis of how one woman's political and romantic strategies influenced the development of Western civilization. Henry VIII's 6 marriages give us a window into one of the most dramatic periods in English history, but they also give us insights into timeless questions about power, relationships, and human nature. Henry's story reminds us that even the most powerful people are still human, with all the strengths and weaknesses that humanity entails. The 6 women who married Henry each responded to impossible circumstances in their own way, and their stories remind us that we always have choices about how we respond to the challenges we face, even when we can't control the circumstances themselves. Most importantly, Henry's marriages show us that personal decisions and historical forces are always intertwined in ways that we might not expect. The choices we make in our private lives can have public consequences, and the political decisions that leaders make are always influenced by their personal psychology and relationships. Understanding these connections between the personal and the political, between individual choices and historical change, is essential for understanding not just the past, but the present and future as well. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most fascinating and complex personal stories. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which aspect of Henry VIII's marriages you found most interesting or surprising. I'll see you next time for another deep dive into the human stories behind historical change.